People say, oh, so-and-so must be a good Christian, very, very moral person. Listen, many people are moral. Many people. Many people live by high standards of honesty, charity, kindness, morality, ethics. Many people. Very ethical on the surface. Very moral. Very charitable. Very kind. Very honest, ostensibly. A lot of people like that. There are a lot of unsaved people in liberal churches who are very compassionate, very ethical. They are set to live according to the 10 Commandments. Many of them trying to live according to the Sermon on the Mount. Live out the quote-unquote golden rule. Many ethical people living by a moral code. That in itself does not verify salvation. Because you can subscribe yourself to a moral code for a multiplicity of reasons, right? Fear. Some people live by a moral code because they're afraid of God. They're afraid of God. Some people live by a moral code because they want to please their parents. And it's very important that their parents be pleased because they're under their parents. There are some people who live by a moral code because they believe that if they do, that'll get them to heaven. Or they believe if they do, God will reward them somehow in this life by making them rich or famous or successful. There are some people who live by a moral code just to avoid a dirty conscience and guilt. I mean, there could be a lot of reasons for that. But that is not synonymous with salvation because there are so many reasons why people could live and do live by a moral code. Let me give you an illustration of that. Go back to Matthew chapter 19. And here you meet a very familiar personality. In Matthew chapter 19 and verse 16, here comes a rich young ruler as we know him. And he says in verse 16, "Teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may obtain eternal life?" Now the guy confesses, I don't have eternal life. I don't have any hope for the future. I'm worried about dying. I don't know where I'm going. He was not secure. He was afraid of the future. I want eternal life. Now, mark it in your mind. He knew he didn't have eternal life. The point is this. He hadn't attained what he wanted. He hadn't yet attained what he wanted. How had he been trying to attain it? Well, Jesus brings that out. Because Jesus says to him, if you want to enter into life, in verse 17, keep the commandments. In other words, if you want to do it the way you're trying to do it, then just keep the commandments. He says, which ones? Jesus said, you shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the young man said to him, all these things I have kept. What am I still lacking? Is that amazing? What he is saying is this, I never murdered anybody. I never committed adultery with anybody. I never stole from anyone. I have not purposely borne false witness against someone. I have done my best to honor my father and my mother, and I have tried to love my neighbor as myself. I've done all those things. Mark it in your mind. He had done all those things, at least to the level that he assessed them, which would not be a true level. He hadn't truly done them, but his deceitful heart would lie to him about what he'd done. But he thought he'd kept it all. That was his goal. Keep the 10 Commandments, keep the 10 Commandments. So here he's got a life of keeping the 10 Commandments. He comes to Jesus and says, all this keeping of the 10 Commandments, and I'm telling you, I don't have what? Eternal life. Because eternal life is not the product of that. Sure, he hadn't kept them in their fullness. Jesus said that when I said you shall not commit murder, I meant you shouldn't hate either. That's behind the murder. And when I said you shouldn't commit adultery, I meant that you shouldn't even look on a woman to lust after her. You've committed it in your heart. No, he hadn't fully kept those things, but on the surface, he had done his best to keep them all. But he knew he still didn't have eternal life. The point is this, you can live by the highest ethical code, the one given in Exodus 20, the very 10 Commandments of God, and still not have eternal life. Because the one does not necessarily mean the other. A moral life didn't save him, and yet he was trying to live a moral life in order to get eternal life. So, a past event doesn't assure your salvation, and neither does living by a moral code, because you could do that for a lot of reasons. A lot of people do. Thirdly, another, I think, misconception, another element of this negative approach, what does not verify salvation, is knowledge of the truth. knowledge of the truth. We used to call it head knowledge. You ever heard that phrase? Head knowledge instead of heart knowledge. There are a lot of people who know the facts about Christ. They know the facts about God. They know God is God. They know God is 3 in 1. They know Christ is the Son of God. They know Christ is deity. They know Christ came into the world and did miracles. They know Christ died on the cross. They know that he died a substitutionary death. They know that he rose again on the third day, that he offers salvation by grace. And they know all of that in their head, but that's not synonymous with salvation. It's not what you know. In fact, the Pharisees and the scribes, like the other Jews that I've just mentioned, like Simon, who was looking at an event, like the rich young ruler, who was looking at a moral, ethical standard, other Jews knew all about Christ from his birth on. They knew everything about him. That's why he says in Matthew 12, you can't be saved. You've committed an unpardonable sin. Why? You've seen it all, you've heard it all, you've experienced it all, and you won't believe. You have it all in your mind. It's the same thing in Hebrews 6. You've been enlightened. You've tasted the heavenly gift. You've tasted the powers of the age to come. But you won't believe. You won't receive. It is not enough to have a head knowledge. Faith without works is what? Dead. And James 2:19, the devils believe, but they tremble. And they're not saved. You can believe it's all true. I've had a friend through the years, and for as long as I've known him, and it's probably 25 years, he says, I believe it all, but I'm not going to commit my life to it until I'm through enjoying the things that I want to enjoy. The head knowledge doesn't mean anything. The Jews had all of that. Many people have that. The classic illustration is a man among the 12. What's his name? Judas. What more information could that man have had in his head? He had it all. He had it all. 3 years under the tutelage of the living Son of God. He knew it all. He saw it all. He felt it all. He experienced it all. And he never, ever was saved. He went to his own place when he committed suicide. Fourthly, this is another non-proof of salvation. Let's call it religious activity. Religious activity. Going to church, being baptized, taking communion, or whatever, lighting candles, praying beads, doing religious pilgrimages, doing certain prayers, staying on your knees, marching here, marching there, whatever it is. Many, many people go through complex religious motions thinking that all of that religious activity equates to salvation.